Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. Today's video is going to use John F. Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, as a hub and spoke wheel to examine a number of CIA or clandestine service bank-sponsored psych ops events which do involve murder, do involve mendacity, cover stories, parallel narratives, and the usual suspects. All right, I'm going to try to keep this video under 30 minutes, which is going to be challenging. Please get an adult beverage, sit back, relax, and I'm going to stay on the surface level. However, you'll find that my videos do delve deeper below the surface than your typical videos that are out there in the internet, military complex controlled social media platform system. So I'm sort of an anomaly. At some point my show will go dark and you'll never know what happened to me. That's just how the history book reads on these clandestine programs. So my mother always taught me to set the table before you sit down and start eating dinner. So briefly I'll have to tell you that there'd be no Jack Kennedy unless there was a Joseph P. Kennedy first, his father, who had a Wall Street background, not just trafficking whiskey during the Prohibition, but he was plugged into Wall Street. Irish Catholic family, so I think it might fit into what the Jewish Yiddish people, there's a Yiddish word that defines the role of the Joe P. Kennedy family, which is the word I've been fairly unfamiliar with it. I got to credit my guest for telling me what a Shambas Goy is. Shambas Goy is kind of a useful tool, an employee of a Jewish family to do biddings that they're forbidden to do on the Sabbath. So Catholics seem to be available on Saturday, and so hence we have a partnership between the Jewish people and the Catholics, and especially the Jesuits, which pop in and out of all my stories. All right, and that's certainly true in the Jack Kennedy story. So before I start with Jack Kennedy's assassination, I want to set the table like my mother taught me and let you know that in 1928, when Jack Kennedy was only 21 years old, his father was involved in the purchase of the Sharon Tate murder scene, in case you didn't know. There's a lot of stories out there about John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy being associated with Marilyn Monroe in the 1960s. And of course, you know, she was murdered in Brentwood, not too far from where O.J. Simpson's second ex-wife was murdered, over there on Bundy Drive. Off of San Vicente Drive. Well, Marilyn Monroe lived north off San Vicente Drive, walking distance from where Nicole Brown Simpson was murdered. Had her carotid arteries slit in an Operation Gladio style knife attack. But people don't talk about Benedict Canyon as it relates to the Kennedy family, because there would never be a Sharon Tate murder or Abigail Folger murder at that location on Cielo Drive, Sunbrook, Bella, were it not for Joe Kennedy and RKO Radio Pictures purchasing 3.3 acres at that parcel. They also purchased 3.3 acres 150 feet down the hillside at 10048 Cielo Drive, which actually is on Cielo Drive. The murder scene for Abigail Folger and Sharon Tate is on Bella Drive, but the media has convinced everyone that it's 10050 Cielo Drive, off Cielo Drive. Cielo Drive off Cielo Drive. But I'm here to tell you it's Bella Drive. But if you don't believe that, then just say it's Sunbrook Drive, because if you go to 10100 or 10106, where Timothy Leary lived, 10106 Sunbrook Drive, park your car and just walk up the hill, you'll be at the murder scene on Sunbrook Drive. That's the quickest way to get to the murder scene property that RKO Pictures bought the land all the undeveloped property on which later became Sunbrook Drive. At the time, it had no name; it was just undeveloped land. And they bought 10048 Cielo Drive, which was raw land, and they bought 10050 Cielo Drive, which was raw land. Then they had to bulldoze and excavate and remove the dirt and build platforms so that homes could be built. And that was done by RKO Radio Pictures, and they purchased the land just before Pearl Harbor in November, around Thanksgiving, 1941. The Benedict Canyon crime scene was purchased, with Joe Kennedy being a big controlling interest in RKO Radio Pictures. He was partnered, of course, with Jewish people, of course, and the Jewish people were really in charge. And the number one Jewish person in charge of the Cielo Drive crime scene was an executive from RCA, Marconi Wireless Company. And I'll give you his name. His name is, of course, David Sarnoff, RCA executive, Marconi Wireless Company, Russian-born Jewish man, executive for RCA. He organized the Joe P. Kennedy financing along with three other Jewish men of KAO, acronym KAO. That was Benjamin Franklin Keith, Edward Franklin Albee, and Martin Beck Orpheum of the Orpheum Theaters. Those three Jewish men owned vaudeville theaters and theaters to be converted to motion pictures, the new latest technology. And so we have the people who control the delivery platform for media, social media content of Hollywood. And we have Joe Kennedy providing the financing. And then we have David Sarnoff, Jewish RCA executive, and he'll control the management of RKO Radio Pictures, which had Gene Harlow on contract. And they put Gene Harlow, up, that was living up the hill at 9820 Easton Drive, where her husband was murdered. Remember him? Paul Levy Byrne was shot in the head with a pistol, leaving a typed suicide note, kind of like a Columbo. So he's murdered. It's walking distance, except there's no sidewalks. It's walking distance to the Sharon Tate murder scene. Yeah, as the crow flies, it's about half a mile. Because you have to go and backtrack, it's closer to a mile in a car. But be that as it may, David Sarnoff is running the show for RCA for the 12 to 15 acres of property off Cielo Drive and Angelo Drive, which later became named Sunbrook Drive, Cielo Drive, Bella Drive, and today is occupied by Jeff Franklin, a Jewish television producer of Full House, and he lives in a monstrosity home which destroyed the crime scene at that murder scene. So it's always been under Jewish control. Always. Always. So Joe Kennedy was involved in the creation of this RKO Radio Pictures in October 1928. And in November 1941, they developed the Sharon Tate murder scene, which was used for porn films and for scandalous parties and for provisional housing to a Rothschild's granddaughter, and for Doris Day's son, and Mark Lindsay, who became the spokesperson for Paul Revere and the Raiders, and they had a red Ferrari parked in the garage that was attributed to him. Then that was in 1967, and then in 1969, after the Sharon Tate murder, they attributed that same red Ferrari to belonging to Roman Polanski, who never lived on the property, never spent a single night there. Peter Sellers, Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen, Robert Vaughn, they all spent time at parties there. Jane Fonda, Henry Fonda, lived on the property for a short time. Let's not forget Cary Grant and Diane Cannon supposedly spent a couple nights there for their honeymoon. Diane Cannon, a much younger woman. She's in her mid-20s, and Cary Grant was in his 60s when they got married. Then who else we got there? We got the fake owner, Rudy Altobelli, allegedly lived in the pool house for a while. We had a doctor who owned the property for a while, straw owners. But RKO Radio Pictures, or Hollywood, has always owned that property because they're part of the military complex of the clandestine service, which includes Mossad, and includes CIA, and includes KGB, it includes all clandestine service agencies. Most important, of course, would be Office of Naval Intelligence, Office of Army Intelligence, because we know that Sharon Tate's father worked for Army Intelligence, don't we, in Operation Gladio, throughout the world, throughout the whole world, from Verona, Italy, to Germany, to San Pedro, Fort MacArthur, to Presidio, Letterman Hospital, San Francisco, Army Base, adjacent to Nancy and Paul Pelosi, and Diane Goldman Feinstein and Haight-Ashbury, where he was assigned to deal with anti-war moving peaceniks out of Haight-Ashbury as part of the HAP, Haight-Ashbury Project. The reason I'm setting the stage this way is that those things were going on before Jack Kennedy was elected president. Also in Cuba, which is a complete Navy intelligence controlled island, since 1898, the United States Navy, since before the Spanish-American War, remember the Maine and to hell with Spain, February 14th, 1898, the United States Maine was sunk in the port of Havana, Cuba, killing 268 sailors, with William Randolph Hearst telling his reporters to, you take the photos, I'll provide the war. And the United States Navy set up Guantanamo Bay during 1898. I believe that it was established before 1898, but officially the United States Navy set up operations which later became Guantanamo Bay. It was vastly expanded and developed in 1940 before Pearl Harbor. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy and the United States Marines signed a contract with a gentleman who owned a construction company to develop Guantanamo Bay, which later was home to Ron DeSantis and his prisoner dilemma game, Office of Navy Intelligence, Office of Judge Advocacy, where he pretended to be a fake defense lawyer for all of those people illegally imprisoned at the detention center of Guantanamo Bay with no civil rights at all and no Nuremberg rights, no Geneva Convention in force at Guantanamo Bay. It's the law of the sea, it's maritime law, and there's not much for Ron DeSantis to do other than to torment people with false promises. Because Ron DeSantis, Yale and Harvard Law, has no authority to bestow any rights upon the prisoners of Guantanamo Bay. But what I wanted to tell you, in case you didn't know, that Guantanamo Bay was expanded and developed during 1940 and 41 at the same time that the Cielo crime scene was being developed. 1942, 43, 44, opened for business in 1945 for Hollywood-controlled activities in Benedict Canyon. Guantanamo Bay was also coming online. This is 15 years before we have the Fidel Castro situation. And you know that Fidel Castro was Catholic, and he was raised in a Catholic family, and he was Jesuit indoctrinated in Santiago, Cuba, at two different Jesuit schools in Santiago, Cuba. Now that's important because Jose Perdomo, who went on to murder John Lennon at the Dakota in New York City on or around December 8th, 1980, he grew up in Santiago, Cuba also, as did Jeff Bezos' stepfather, Miguel Bezos. He grew up in Santiago, Cuba. And that is where Fidel Castro was indoctrinated in Jesuit schools. Fidel Castro was I wonder if Jeff Bezos' stepfather was indoctrinated in Jesuit training in Santiago, Cuba. I'll bet he was. You know that Jeff Bezos' real name is Jorgensen. It's Jeffrey Preston Jorgensen. And he got the Preston from his maternal grandfather because, see, it's like the Charlie Manson story, whose real name is Miles Maddox because that was his mother's name. You have a situation with Jeffrey Bezos that his mother was 16 years old when she was pregnant with him, by Ted Jorgensen, who owned a bicycle store. Ted Jorgensen was 19 years old, and Jackie Geese, spelled Gise, she's 16 years old, and she gets pregnant by a 19-year-old boy in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he owns a bike store. And Jacqueline, okay, her father, the reason she's in Albuquerque because her father's a big shot at the United States Atomic Energy Commission. So her father's a big shot in the clandestine services. So he looks after his little daughter, Jackie, and he moves Ted Jorgensen aside, and he brings in Miguel Bezos, who fled Havana, Cuba, and Santiago under the Fidel Castro regime in 1962. Miguel Bezos enters the United States and then quickly goes on to marry Jacqueline Jorgensen Geese, and becomes the adopted father for Jeffrey Bezos Jorgensen. Do you see? Fidel Castro, the guy who is the leader and lived to age 90 in a CIA-controlled country called Cuba. 50 years as the leader of Cuba, as a dictator for the CIA. He was indoctrinated in Santiago, Cuba. Okay? Jose Perdomo, the guy who murdered John Kennedy, was indoctrinated in Santiago, Cuba, and was a police chief in that town also, under the Batista regime. And he fled Cuba after Fidel Castro took over in 1959. Fidel Castro was declared the prime minister of Cuba in February 1959. And the murderer of John Kennedy left after that, as did Jose Menendez. Jose Menendez of the porn business. Jose Menendez fled Havana, Cuba in 1959 and worked for the CIA until his death at age 45 in Beverly Hills. Not too far from where Bugsy Seigel got murdered by a military weapon, an M1 carbine semi-automatic rifle in 1947 in Beverly Hills. You see a pattern here? I got Fidel Castro. I got Jeff Bezos' stepfather, where he got his name, Bezos. I got the murderer of John Lennon, all coming out of the same village, Santiago, Cuba, right? Where there's Jesuits all over that place. And then Fidel Castro went on eventually to a Jesuit university in Havana, and then transferred to the University of Havana, Cuba, where he graduated, and then hooks up with Frank Sturgis, not his real name, who works for the CIA, coming out of the United States Marines. Frank Sturgis' real name is Frank Angelo Fiorini from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And he works closely with Fidel Castro on training his guerrillas for the revolution of Cuba during 1958 until Batista, surrendered essentially on, New Year's Day or New Year's evening. December 31st, 1958 was goodbye, General Batista, and hello, Fidel Castro. And all this media fake stories about how everybody's afraid of the communist Fidel Castro, Jesuit Catholic educated, works for the CIA and has worked for the CIA for 60 years and was never assassinated. You mean to tell me the CIA can kill John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, they can kill George de Mohrenschildt, they can kill William Colby, a former director of CIA, they can kill Jose Menendez, they can kill Sharon Tate, they can kill Abigail Folger, all right? And they cannot kill Fidel Castro. And the reason is because they don't want to kill him because he works for them and he's a boogeyman, right? I mean, Jim Jones, he did a good job too, right? We know that CIA controls Cuba and the United States Navy controls Cuba because I'll tell you why. Because people like Jose Menendez and Jose Perdomo and Jeff Bezos' stepfather, Miguel, they come and go. They can come and go, no problem. They had no problem with their passport. They get free transportation to Miami anytime they want. And I got other people that have come and go. Did you know that Jim Jones flew to Havana, Cuba to have a meeting with Huey Newton of the Black Panthers In 1977, while Huey Newton was a student at University of California, Santa Cruz, and somebody pays for him to fly to Havana to meet with Jim Jones, and Jim Jones goes on to the People's Temple Agricultural Project in British intelligence, British Guiana, on Union Carbide property to have what the media called Jonestown. But just before that, Huey Newton is meeting with Jim Jones in Havana, Cuba, just like Charlie Manson met with Jim Jones in Philo and Ukiah, Mendocino in 1967, Summer of Love. During the Summer of Love in July, Charlie Manson was sent to Ukiah, Mendocino County, up where the Greenfield Ranch is, 5,400 acres of CIA controlled property, where Jim Jones was an operational agent, where he was the foreman. Jim Jones was the foreman of the grand jury for the county of Mendocino when Charles Miles Maddox met with him. Well, that's the same situation you got with Jeff Bezos' stepfather and with the murderer of John Lennon and Frank Fiorini. And who else I got coming and going? Jim Jones coming and going. Let's not forget Fidel Castro. He came and went too. You realize that after he took the oath of office to be prime minister of Cuba in February 1959, February 16th, he then flies to New York City to visit and to meet with the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, who is not available, so he sends Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon meets with Fidel Castro in New York, right? In 1959. So there's no problem with Fidel Castro. He's traveling to New York City. There's no problem with Fidel Castro. There's not a problem with him until Jack Kennedy becomes president. It's all a psychops. There was no Bay of Pigs invasion. I mean, there was, but it wasn't really a serious event. There was no Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. There was a psychops, where the only person I think that died was one of the U-2 spy pilots, I think crashed into, off Miami, Florida, and ended up drowning at 90 feet under the water. But there was no fisticuffs during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 13 days of October. So when I'm trying to tell you, if you work for CIA, you come and go. If you work for the United States Navy, the United States Marines, the CIA, you come and go from Havana, Cuba all the time. If you don't believe me, ask Jeff Bezos, because his stepfather is part of that formula. All those things were going on before John Kennedy became president of the United States. And you do know that John Kennedy did the usual indoctrination. He went to Harvard. He spent some time in London at the School of Economics. I don't think he graduated. He spent some time at Stanford University, Leland Stanford Junior University, where he didn't graduate, just like Elizabeth Holmes spent time at Stanford University, didn't graduate. Now she's going to be a federal prisoner on her birth of her second child. Just had another child. She wants to postpone her incarceration, maybe hoping for a pardon, which I believe she will be getting a pardon of some kind. Since she works for CIA, her father worked at Enron as an executive. Enron is a CIA operation, part of General Electric. GE brings good things to light. Remember, Ronald Reagan was the spokesperson for GE. It's a CIA company. All right, so anyway, Jack Kennedy took the oath of office on January 20th, 1961. And 3 days before that, the public didn't know, but John Kennedy did. His friend, Patrice Lumumba, was murdered by a firing squad execution, summary execution, with the Belgian and CIA managers, and I'm sure they had local in-country people pulling the trigger on Patrice Lumumba, who was 35 years old and was a democratically elected first prime minister of the Congo. The first prime minister democratically elected. He had previously been a traveling beer salesman before he took a job at the post office in Stanleyville, where he worked for 11 years before he became the democratically elected president of the Congo. That job lasted 82 days. He was 82 days in office. So he made it a little bit longer than Pope John Paul I did. Remember, Pope John Paul I lasted 33 days as Pope. I believe that's the shortest papacy in history. 33, Masonic, number 33. Anyway, Patrice Lumumba, 30 days after being elected Prime Minister of the Congo, he travels to New York City, just like Fidel Castro had done the year before. And Patrice Lumumba travels to New York City, and I'll be real specific. He goes and visits New York. He's elected Prime Minister, I believe it was June 24th, 1960, and he visits New York City on 1 month later, July 24th, 1960, where Jack Kennedy meets with him. Jack Kennedy is running for president against Richard Milhous Nixon, who's vice president for Dwight Eisenhower, who was previously president of Columbia University, CIA Spooksville School. And Jack Kennedy meets with Patrice Lumumba in New York after Patrice Lumumba won his presidential election and is 30 days in. He only gets another 52 days when he's arrested, detained. He's murdered on January 17th, 1961, 3 days before John Kennedy takes his oath of office. And I know that John Kennedy knew through his intelligence sources that his friend Patrice Lumumba was murdered by the CIA. That's kind of a little reminder, I think, to Jack Kennedy that you are a figurehead and you're not running the show. You're not a real president. You got to be a fake president. They had to send a little warning, remember, to Dwight Eisenhower because he issued that executive order that no flyovers over Russia during the month of May 1960. And then we had the Gary Powers incident where he landed safely in the farm field and the media told you that the Russians shot him out of the sky, which was a lie. No, it's impossible. He'd be dead and you wouldn't have all of his personal identification, including his lodge card, under the seat cushion. All right. My point is that Jack Kennedy got a warning just like Dwight Eisenhower got a warning in his last months of presidency. They gave a new warning to Jack Kennedy by murdering a democratically elected Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. Well, anyway, you should then know that Jack Kennedy didn't take that warning very seriously because he and his younger brother, Robert, who's only 40 years old, and Jack Kennedy is only 43 years old, man, oh man, what an action-packed presidency that JFK was. That presidency only lasted 33 months. 33 and a half months, approximately. He took the oath of office on January 20th, 1961, and then fasten your seatbelt because he was furious that they killed Patrice Lumumba. So first thing he does is he tells his brother Robert, get that drug-dealing CIA agent Carlos Marcello, who's a Sicilian who was born in Tunisia and has a Tunisian passport citizenship, but no United States citizenship. So Carlos Marcello was scheduled to go to his immigration every year meeting since he was a visitor in New Orleans, successful businessman of casinos, burlesque clubs, money laundering facilities, partners with Clay Shaw and the Trademark. Where was Jack Kennedy heading when he had his head blown off? The Trademark, Dallas? What was Clay Shaw the president of? Trademark, New Orleans? Where was Abigail Folger indoctrinated into the CIA? Gotham Bookmart in Manhattan when she was assigned to the Robert Kennedy presidential campaign in 1968 with her control agent, Polish Jew Wojtek Frykowski, who was older than her. Was 7 years older than her. 7 years older than her. Twice divorced. Abigail didn't even have a boyfriend. So what I'm telling you is MART, that's code for CIA Front Company. Clay Shaw, they're in transportation hubs. Dallas is a transportation hub. The port of New Orleans, the World Trade Center bombings were in New York port facility, the Port of New York. Huey Newton was killed at the Port of Oakland, 3 blocks from the containerization gate. Sharon Tate's father was assigned to Fort MacArthur, Port of Long Beach, Port of Los Angeles. It's a port facility. It's where Lino LaBianca was trained, at those port facility at Fort MacArthur. That's where Terminal Island Federal Prison is, in the port facility. That's where Jack Kennedy was headed before he was murdered, to a port facility transportation hub, Dallas Trade Mart. Anyway, so Jack Kennedy tells his brother Robert to send United States justice agents and the FBI to the meeting with Carlos Marcello. And on April 4th, 1961, Carlos Marcello is kidnapped and put on a plane and deported to Guatemala, where the CIA operates, its training facility for the guerrillas that eventually, were part of the Cuban Revolution and the Bay of Pigs and the Kennedy assassination. So, payback is a biatch, as we say. But anyway, so Carlos Marcello ends up getting put in the middle of a jungle in his alligator, skin shoes and his fancy silk suit. And there he is with all that high humidity in Guatemala. So needless to say, it takes him, 45 days to 2 months to get back to New Orleans. And nothing's ever done about deporting him again. But it was a real FU by John and Robert Kennedy to get a CIA drug dealer out of town. But it was a big FU to the CIA because Carlos Marcello is a very important person. He works closely with Santos Trapacante and Meyer Lansky in Miami. And they're associated with the Genovese crime family of New York and all 5 crime families of New York. So then the next thing after they kidnap Carlos Marcello and send him to Guatemala, which they do, right after Jack Kennedy takes office. I mean, when I say right after, I mean, within 40 days of him taking office, Carlos Marcello is now in the jungle with no cell phone, trying to figure out how to get back home until David Ferrie is dispatched, who's a CIA pilot, and flew the killers in and out of Dallas for the John Kennedy assassination. But he flew Carlos Marcello back home to New Orleans in 1961 once he got word that that's where he was. But you should know that Robert Kennedy immediately starts arresting drug dealing agents under the racketeering laws for the 5 crime families of New York. And they create 852 criminal cases against people associated with the crime families of New York. 852 cases. That ends up being about 1,852 arrests of CIA-related drug trafficking people over the 33 months that John Kennedy was president. So he's making arrests of 5 people a week, something like that, to get that number up to 1,850 arrests. Now, you should know, of course, since they all work for the CIA and the 5 crime families in New York, like 99% of those arrests, the people are going to be released. Most of them are not going to be formally arraigned with a felony, and the cases are not going to stick, and no one is going to get sentenced for any crime. So that happens, but it's an annoying thing for the CIA to have a president who is actively, interfering with their drug distribution business. So they throw the Bay of Pigs at John Kennedy on April 17th, 1961. This is a joke. It's 1,200, Cuban exiles. Maybe it's 13. You can't get a straight number. I've heard 1,500 or 1,400 or heard 1,200. Anyway, you got 10,000 municipal policemen. You've got 15,000 Russian advisors, KGB. You've got 20,000 paramilitary people from the Fidel Castro, guerrillas that the CIA trained. They trained Fidel Castro's guerrillas, are all CIA trained. And they trained the Cuban exiles. Do you see how ridiculous this is? Anyway, it's like 60,000 people on Fidel Castro versus 1,200 people, Cuban exiles, quote unquote. The Bay of Pigs invasion lasts, a day and a half. There's a dozen people killed. The rest are imprisoned. They're, of course, released the next year. supposedly 20 months of confinement, probably at Guantanamo Bay would be my guess, hosted by the United States Marines and United States Army facility at the east end of the island, so we could have the fake Bay of Pigs. Then the next thing that happens right away, quick like a bunny rabbit, as soon as the Bay of Pigs thing fizzles out, John Kennedy flies to New York City to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where he delivers that nuclear bomb of a speech on the 27th of April, 1961, to the press club, the media of the world, of the United States, and basically flirts with them, flatters them, draws them in, and then bitch slaps them with the guerrillas by night, armies by day, infiltration, not invasion, subversion, not free election, intimidation, not free choice, maritime law, law of the sea, totalitarian, corporate imperialism, colonialism on steroids, anti-imperialism speech, the kind of poetry that Patrice Lumumba used to write. He wrote poetry about anti-imperialism. Jack Kennedy delivered a speech and his death sentence on April 27, 1961, at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where he said, F you to the CIA, F you to the banks. All right, so then what came next? Well, then they threw the Cuban Missile Crisis at him, right? Except it's not really a crisis because nobody got killed. I think a U-2 spy pilot might have gone down. But anyway, that was October 16th, 1962, the 13 days of October 1962. Nothing happened, right? As a psych ops, trying to scare all the Americans, we're all going to die from a nuclear attack. Nope, not true, didn't happen. Then John Kennedy counters back on June 4th, 1963 with Executive Order 11110, later amended to 10289, to authorize the Secretary of the Treasury to issue silver certificate Treasury IOU notes directly, not using Wall Street bankers. Well, boy, if you want to really annoy the banks, you go right around them with your cryptocurrency ideas, right? It's kind of a Sam Bankman-Fried story, right? It's kind of a Bitcoin. Bitcoin's not a good example because Bitcoin runs on the military internet platform, so not a good example. Gold coins, silver coins, barter and exchange, exchanging your labor for food, those are legitimate means of a money system. All other means, from cryptocurrency to bank digital passports to digital money, are fraudulent, criminal, nefarious. They're not based on anything. They're not based on mathematics. They're not based on collateral. They're fiat schemes. They're all fiat, unauditable. They're unauditable. If cryptocurrency cannot be audited, it is not legitimate. If fractional banking cannot be audited, and you cannot audit the Fed, and you cannot really audit a bank, then you're dealing with a criminal enterprise. So, look, do they work? Yeah. In words of one executive banker, they work until they don't work anymore. And I think if you invested in FTX, Alameda Research, Sequoia Capital created, CI Bank created, you got a lesson in it doesn't work anymore. You lost all your money. So that's a good example of how cryptocurrency can fail. It fails when the CIA pushes the button and decides that it should fail. And that can happen to Bitcoin at any moment. All right. It can also happen to our fake money system at any moment, and I'm sure it will. That's when we'll go to the central bank digital currency crypto social scores. It'd be a credit score, obedience, participation, crypto, techno enslavement system. Anyway, so Jack Kennedy goes forward with that. That really infuriates the bankers. Then he backs it right up with National Security Advisory Memorandum number 263 on October 11th, 1963. This is to pull all the contractors, Bechtel, Brown and Root, Lockheed Martin, Northrop, Bell Helicopters, all the building of the roads and the infrastructure for the southern, portion of French Polynesia, Vietnam, to pull them out and send them home. So then the CIA counters with the murdering of the Diem Brothers, who are the CIA puppet, Roman Catholic, indoctrinated leaders of South Vietnam, which doesn't really exist, in a country that's 100% Buddhist, except for the Jesuit indoctrinated Catholics. Anyway, the Diem brothers are murdered in the back of a truck on November 2nd, 1963, 20 days before Jack Kennedy is killed. Then John Kennedy is murdered on the 22nd of November 1963 on the way out of town of Dallas, shot by a flangeable bullet head on from the triple underpass, where which is a train trestle. In case you didn't know, it's a train trestle. It's not a car auto freeway. It's a train trestle. The Stemmons Freeway is set back another couple hundred yards, probably 500-600 yards to the west. But you see, there's not a lot of witnesses, and you could have the killer, which I heard it was Frank Fiorini, a.k.a. Frank Sturgis, but it was probably multiple shooters, all armed with flangeable bullets and taking their turns if necessary. And it appears that it wasn't necessary. There was one bullet that, remember, hit John Kennedy in the neck. That came from the front. That came from the Stemmons, the triple overpass. Remember, it's triple because it's 3 roads that go underneath the railroad trestle. Elm Street to the north, Main Street in the center, Commerce Street to the south. Those are the 3 streets. Elm, Main, Commerce. Jack Kennedy was not supposed to be on Elm Street. They kind of pulled a fast one on him. I'm pretty sure he knew something was not going well. And the Secret Service, Ray Kellerman, who was running shotgun, and the driver, William Gere, they work for the CIA, and they're taking orders to park the car when they see Umbrella Man hoisting the umbrella with Radio Man, who are part of the Bay of Pigs invasion. They're sitting at the curb there, and they stand up, put the umbrella up. Abraham Zapruder, Ukrainian Jewish man with the state-of-the-art film camera, is above them on the pedestal by the Bakota, up the concrete stairs next to the picket fence. He is videotaping the murder of John Kennedy. You'll never see the actual film where the car parks, the limo parks right there where Umbrella Man is standing, a couple lanes across Elm Street, a park. We know the car parked because Jackie Kennedy, who's 12 years younger than John Kennedy is 46 years old, Jackie is 34 years old, wearing a pink pencil skirt, holding a dozen red roses, and it's not Valentine's Day. And what is the state flower of Texas? It's the yellow flower of Texas, the yellow rose, the state flower of Texas. And she gets handed red roses, which are about Valentine, romance, and fertility. This is really creepy. Anyway, so her husband's head gets blown off and a piece of brain the size of a softball ends up on the trunk of the car, and Jackie throws the roses on the floor of the limousine and gets up on her knees, hands and knees, in a pencil skirt, grabs the brain until Clint Hill, who's supposed to guard her, but he's not, he's in the limousine behind, he pushes her back in the car, and then they head off to Parkland Hospital by jumping on the Stemmons Freeway. That would be impossible to have happened in real life if the car were moving, because Jackie would have lost her balance and ended up in the gutter. And that didn't happen, right? And Clint Hill, in his dress shoes and flak jacket, he wouldn't have been able to pass the police officers, the Dallas police officers on their motorcycles, if the car was going 25 miles an hour. He's not going to sprint past the motorcycle cops, who are stopped, and lean their motorcycle over. And of course, they reacted to the gunshots from the picket fence, right? But that's not the kill shot. That's just another diversion. Like this idiotic idea that Lee Oswald on the 6th floor of the school book depository, that he shot the president. There probably were shots coming from George H.W. Bush's Daltex building and the book depository, but not the kill shot. They came head on. I've been there, people. You could throw a baseball from where Frank Sturgis or whoever it was, you could throw a baseball from there and hit Jack Kennedy in the nose, okay? You could be a blind man and make that shot. It's straight shot, straight on. And there are no witnesses, and there are no cars, because it's a railroad trestle, and there are no railroad trains active at 12:30 p.m. on November 22nd when Jack Kennedy had his head blown off. Everything else is a diversion. The Oliver Silverstein Stone JFK movie, it's another hoax film. It's a dramatization. They're keeping your eyes away from the triple underpass railroad trestle. That's where the kill shot came from. It didn't come from where Abraham Zapruder was. That was a documentary film. There were other people with cameras, video cameras too, by the way. Abraham Zapruder was not the only Ukrainian Jew down there with a camera. There were others, besides Orville Nix, who I don't think is Jewish. Anyway, his film has more or less been destroyed. You know, I think there's like a 5-second snippet that's left. No one's going to show you that the limousine parked like they're going to have a picnic. But anyway, that implicates William Gere, Ray Kellerman, Clint Hill. It implicates Umbrella Man, the Radio Man. It implicates Frank Sturgis, David Ferry, Clay Shaw, Alan Dulles, Edward Lansdale, Herbert H. Walker Bush, standing there by the book depository. You know, there's at least 250 people involved with that paramilitary assassination of JFK. It's definitely more elaborate because it wasn't a message for the United States. It was a message for the whole colonial world. See, John Kennedy is not the leader of the free world. He's the fake president of the fake United States, which has no constitution, no Bill of Rights, and no representative form of government. It's not a democratic republic. It's maritime law. It's military law, like the rest of the world is. The whole world operates under military law. I think you're getting an education now with COVID and the WHO. I mean, Google follows the WHO guidelines from Geneva, Switzerland, which is a money laundering facility. Lake Leman, Lake Geneva. Geneva, the WHO, home of the Red Cross, home of the World Health Organization. That's who runs the United States of America, the WHO. NATO, that's who Sharon Tate's father worked for, Operation Gladio. That's who James Angleton worked for. That's who William Casey worked for. That's who William Colby works for. That's who Richard Helms worked for. And that's who Jack Kennedy was supposed to work for, but he wasn't following his orders. And what happens when we don't follow orders? Jack Nicholson told us in A Few Good Men, we follow orders or people die. Jack Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, they were quitting. Sharon Tate was quitting. Pregnant, not renewing her contract with MGM. She's quitting. Abigail Folger, getting on a plane, United Airlines flight, 10 o'clock in the morning Saturday, go tav it out with her mother in Pacific Heights, San Francisco. I quit. You got me into this mess, you get me out. Oh no, she got bayoneted 28 times to death before that could happen. Lino LaBianca, military trained, NATO forces, spent 2 years in Europe after World War II, setting up NATO bases. He gets Operation Gladio stabbed 10 times to his chest with a military M7 bayonet. He's quitting. He bought a horse farm in San Diego County. He's getting out of the grocery money laundering business. So he's 45 years old and he got whacked. And let me just review to you some of the people in this story that got whacked. Okay, Lino LaBianca was 44 years old when he got stabbed 10 times to the chest. I believe he was chloroformed or somehow stun gunned, because he's 6 feet tall, 235 pounds, and he had 6 loaded weapons in his mother's house. It was not his house. He lived in the Walt Disney Mansion on Woking Way, 4053 Woking Way. He did not live in that house. He had sold his mansion, and he's moving to San Diego. It was a transition, and they killed him before he could get out of town, like Jack Kennedy got killed before he could get out of Dallas on his way to the business mart, right? The Texas, what was it called? The mart. The trade mart. The Dallas trade mart. So, you know that Bugsy Seigel got put out of business at age 41 in Beverly Hills. And Jose Menendez, who came from Havana, Cuba, he was put out of business at age 45 in Beverly Hills. And he was president of a porn company owned by Jewish people. And movies produced by Jewish people, for Jewish people, and for the whole world. And Jose Menendez was put out of business in Beverly Hills, 90210, just like Bugsy Seigel was. Ben Seigel, who was Jewish. And Jose Perdomo murdered John Lennon, and he came out of Santiago, Cuba, just like Jeff Bezos' stepfather, Miguel Bezos. And Huey Newton was killed at age 47, and he visited Havana, Cuba, and he was killed at the port of Oakland, 3 blocks from the container gate. And Charles Douglas Jackson, who was the publisher for Life magazine and deputy chief of psychological warfare division for OSS and CIA, and the founder of the Bilderberg Group in 1953, and presided at every meeting of the Bilderberg Group from 1953 until 1964, when Charles Douglas Jackson, who paid $150,000 to Abraham Zapruder, who was murdered at age 65, allegedly of stomach cancer. Abraham Zapruder put down at age 65 after he filmed Jack Kennedy's murder, but not before he got paid three payments of $50,000 coming from Life magazine publisher Charles Douglas Jackson, who died at age 62. He died at age 62, and he's a Princeton alumni. That's where Sean Stone is from. That's where William Colby was from. That is where John Foster Dulles is from. That's where Alan Dulles is from, Princeton. That's where John Dunn, who worked for Time Life, was from. Remember, he married Joan Didion, who went to UC Berkeley, who bought the dresses and the wardrobe for Linda Kasabian for the fake Manson trial. She's married to John Dunn, who's the brother of Dominic Dunn, who's the fake writer for Vanity Fair, Dominic Dunn. Older brother to John Dunn, who worked for Time Life with Charles Douglas Jackson and went to Princeton, just like Charles Douglas Jackson did. And that's who paid the Abraham Zapruder family. And they paid him again $6 million, in 1990 something. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you that George de Mohrenschildt, killed at age 65, he was a control agent in Dallas, Texas. He knew Jackie Kennedy. He knew Lee Oswald. He knew George H. Walker Bush personally. He wrote him a handwritten letter. It's rather disturbing. George Bush responded with a typewritten letter. It's rather disturbing. There's electroshock treatments involved with George de Mohrenschildt when he was eventually suicided away by a 47-inch shotgun that you couldn't pull the trigger unless you used your toe. And, of course, George de Mohrenschildt was wearing shoes, which takes out the possibility of being able to kill yourself if you're wearing shoes. So, the John Lennon assassination, the Jeffrey Bezos, how he got his name, the Abraham Zapruder film and documentary of the JFK killing, the executive from Time magazine, Time Life, Charles Douglas Jackson, involvement in the John Kennedy Zapruder film and keeping it secret and intact, Angelo Fiorini, a.k.a. Frank Sturgis, Jose Menendez, Fidel Castro, General Batista, Miguel Bezos, all coming and going from Havana, along with Jim Jones and Huey Newton. Cuba is a CIA office. It's the State Department. It's the United States State Department. All right, that's enough for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk soon. Take care now. Bye-bye.